All right, welcome back. This is sort of mystery 2 about social evolution. How can these Darwinian ideas of natural selection and evolution explain some apparent mysteries in social evolution? And the first we'll talk about is altruism and how that can evolve, how you can have a reasonable evolutionary explanation of altruistic acts, and then extend those ideas that are developed through kin selection to parent-offspring conflict and what's called eusociality, which is a strange evolutionary puzzle on its own. So, if you're thinking about types of social interactions, so we're focusing on within species interactions, not between species. Within a species, you have these social interactions between groups of individuals, and you can divide them into whether they're positive or negative, have positive or negative fitness consequences for the individual that does some kind of behavior, and you call that individual the actor. So the actor is whoever expresses the behavior to do something. So presumably they have the genes to express that behavior. And then the recipient is whoever that behavior is directed to, that it might alter their behavior in some way. So if they both benefit, you get a plus-plus kind of social interaction, you call that mutualism or cooperation. They're both getting some evolutionary fitness benefit from this kind of interaction. It ought to be really easy to imagine how that would evolve, right? Remember, the actor is the individual who has the genes to express this behavior. If you have the genes to express some behavior and that results in a positive fitness effect for you, then it ought to be easy to see how those genes would spread in the population. With me so far? Okay. Selfishness, if the actor benefits and the recipient pays a cost, is it easy to see how that evolves in natural populations? Yeah. Whoever has the genes, the actor, is benefiting. Spite is when the actor pays a cost in order to inflict some kind of harm on the recipient. So you're incurring some kind of cost onto yourself in order to make life worse, even worse for someone else. What a great idea, right? That's what professors do. Actually, it's very, very rare in the natural world. This would be hard to explain, right? You have an actor doing something that lowers its own fitness. You have genes associated with a behavior that lower the transmission rate of those genes into future generations. That would be an evolutionary mystery you should explain, except for the fact that there aren't really any decent examples of spite in the natural world. The ones that are kind of close have some kind of delayed benefit. Altruism is when an actor pays a cost and the recipient benefits. So here's a negative and a positive. Is this easy to explain or intuitive to explain in evolutionary terms? No, because the actor, the genes that the actor has are causing them to express some behavior that lowers their own fitness to the benefit of some other individual. That's not evolutionarily intuitive. But there's, unlike spite, there are tons of examples of apparently altruistic behavior, so it is an evolutionary mystery that needs to be addressed by any decent theory of evolution, so that's what we'll try to do. So, the principal solution to this is what's called kin selection. It was developed by a biologist named Bill Hamilton, and what he realized is that we're used to thinking about genes spreading or not based on their fitness effects on the individual that expresses the behavior, whoever has the gene. But a gene can influence its spread in a population because of its effects, not just on the individual that has that gene and expresses the behavior, but also because of its effect on other individuals in the population that also have copies of the gene. So other individuals that share that gene can be the target of selection, and the gene could have a net increase in fitness because of the effects on one individual. Where is that? Okay, so if a gene is going to influence the fitness of other copies of the gene, you have to ask, where are other copies of the gene likely to be found? More likely than the random population is kin, which is a term not much used outside of the southern U.S., but it means your genetic relatives, your kinfolk, your family, right? So, did I skip a slide there? No. So what's now called Hamilton's rule, after this guy Bill Hamilton, is that a gene will spread in a population if the benefit to the recipient times the degree of relatedness R, which is the likelihood that that individual shares genes with the actor, minus the cost is greater than 0. So this seems a little bit mysterious at first, but think back to what are the normal, non-mysterious conditions for a gene to spread in a population. If the benefit minus the cost is greater than 0, then a gene will spread in a population. There's a net benefit. That's when the actor and the recipient are the same individual, as it were, right? A normal kind of genetic scenario would be if there's a net benefit to the fitness of a gene, it should increase in frequency in the population. And all Hamilton did is he said, well, this can apply to different individuals, but it applies, you have to downweight the benefit by the degree of relatedness R. Whatever that benefit is gets diluted in a genetic sense by the likelihood of those individuals sharing those particular alleles. So this led him to develop what he called inclusive fitness. So the effect of a gene on fitness is not just its effect on the individual that expresses that gene. The total effect of that gene on fitness includes its direct fitness effects and its indirect fitness effects. So the direct fitness is what you're used to thinking about. Some gene affects the likelihood of reproductive success in the individual that is expressing that gene. That's you and your kids. Direct reproduction, direct fitness. But it also has an effect on the reproduction of other individuals. And if they are genetically related to you, they're genetic kin, then you can have indirect fitness effects because of increasing or decreasing their production of offspring over and above what they would have done if you weren't there. So indirect fitness is sort of extra offspring of your brother or uncle or cousin or whatever made possible by you doing something. Just because your uncle or brother has a kid, that's not indirect fitness for you. It's only the extra production of offspring made possible by your babysitting or gift card at Christmas or whatever it was, right? So, what's this mysterious R? It's what downweights that benefit to account for the fact that these other individuals are not genetically identical to you. So because of sexual reproduction, we expect, with meiosis, we expect a 50% reduction in genetic identity between individuals at each successive sexual generation, or sort of degree apart. That's because 50% of your genes come from mom and 50% come from dad. This is for normal diploid outbred organisms. It's going to be different in other kinds of organisms. But normal diploid outbred organisms like you get half your genes from mom and half your genes from dad. So if you have, let's take the case of full siblings, you're related to your mom by a half. You get half of your genes from your mom, and you get half of your genes from your dad. Your mother also, because we're talking about full siblings, also gave half of her genes to your full sibling brother or sister. Are they the same half as you got? No, because there's recombination in your mom. So in all likelihood, you would get a portion of the same genes as your full sibling through your mom, but not all of them. On average, it'll be about a half. Through your dad, you get the same kind of thing. So I'm going to erase this here. It's kind of messy. So the genetic identities, these relatedness values, you can calculate based on a 50% reduction in similarity for each sort of generational step. So all you have to do is count the number of these generational steps and take 0.5 to that power. So here's 1 and 2. So your relatedness to your full sibling through your mom is 0.5 to the 2, which equals, quickly? Yeah, right. Okay. But you're also related to your full sibling through your dad by 0.5 to the 2 equals 0.25. So what's your total relatedness to your full sibling? 0.5. You add these things up. So you have 50% genetic identity to your full sibling. Now this gets really confusing to a lot of people. You're saying, I have 50% genetic similarity to my full sibling, but I hear on the news I'm like 99.6% same DNA as chimpanzees. How come I'm only 50% as my sibling? We're talking about different scales of genetic similarity. This genetic similarity through relatedness R is only for those alleles that vary within a population over and above the kind of baseline similarity in the population. In a sense, it applies to rare alleles in a population, not due to all of your DNA. You are 99-point-something% DNA similar to chimpanzees, but your relatedness to chimpanzees in this kind of sense is not, they're not equivalent conversations, really. This is for rare alleles. The likelihood of sharing rare alleles by descent is this kind of R calculation. So through, if you're half siblings, you share only one parent, related to that parent by a half, the recipient by a half, so R equals a quarter. Cousins, it's a half times a half times a half, which is an eighth. You could do this, right? What is it to your grandparents? An eighth. You just put them up here and go, doot. Right? Okay. So here's some that for normal diploid outbred populations, full siblings R would equal a half, parent offspring R equals a half. Your relatedness to yourself is 1, which is becomes relevant later. It's also relevant in genetically cloning organisms, things that are asexually reproducing. They have a relatedness of 1 to all of themselves. Identical twin, R is 1. Aunt or uncle is a quarter, not the one that married in, but the one through shared ancestry. Grandparents a quarter, cousins eighth, etc. So now we need sort of clarification, conceptual clarification. Just like when we're talking about sexual selection and mate choice, I said, well, animals don't think, ooh, that's a really attractive male with long tail feathers. He'll make me have high genetic quality offspring that are resistant to ectoparasites. There's none of that going on, right? Their nervous system responds to these stimuli, and if it responds in a way that leads to higher fitness, then that kind of neural response system is favored. And if they receive these stimuli that makes them respond to them in a way that leads to lower fitness, then that kind of pathway of neural reaction is disfavored. It tends to go away. So here, animals are not calculating Hamilton's rule and going, you're my cousin, you're my Uncle Bob, any of this kind of stuff. They don't know, they don't sit around figuring out is BR minus C greater than 0 or not. They just do things. They have kind of behavioral rules of thumb is what I call them. A hungry bird in my nest that is begging for food, I feed it. That's a behavioral rule of thumb. If most of the time in your lineage, that baby bird in your nest is your offspring, that behavioral rule of thumb will be favored because it leads to higher fitness. But if you're subject to high levels of brood parasitism by cuckoos or brown-headed cowbirds or something, then there's a significant chance that the offspring in your nest begging for food is not actually your genetic offspring, and that behavioral rule might be disfavored. So if BR minus C is not greater than 0, then you just have selection acting to modify the behavioral interaction. It's not that animals are figuring this out. Right? So the behavior and the genetics behind it, but also the kind of response system to stimuli are favored by selection if BR minus C is greater than 0, and they're disfavored if BR minus C is less than 0. Does that make sense?
You're like, yeah, sure.
Okay. So, that explanation of kin selection and inclusive fitness is the dominant explanation for most cases of apparent altruism in nature. Right? I say apparent altruism because if you're thinking about it genetically in an evolutionary sense like this, it's obvious that altruism isn't really altruistic. You're not really just trying to do someone a favor at your own expense just because you're nice. It's favored by natural selection through inclusive fitness, the way other traits that are around, or other adaptations that are around, are favored by natural selection. So there's a bunch of these. Parental care is one. Alarm calling, warning other individuals of predators in the area, increases the risk to you but might save them. There's a bunch of examples with ground squirrels we'll talk about. A whole bunch of things have what are called sort of helpers at the nest, individuals that don't disperse into the environment. Instead, they stay with their parents and help their parents raise future offspring, which are usually siblings or half-siblings. So there's a bunch of examples like that we'll kind of talk about. So here's this ground squirrel. They live in social groups of genetically related females. So as they grow up, the male offspring disperse away, and the female offspring tend to stay put. So you have a whole bunch of ground squirrels that are grandmothers, mothers, aunts, sisters, and so on and so forth. And then you have occasional unrelated males that come in and mate within that group. And so you have whole sets of structured kin groups, mostly through females. And what happens is that when a predator is spotted, like a hawk or a snake or a coyote, an individual that sees it might or might not call and say, "Coyote over there," right? And everyone runs down into their little ground squirrel holes and they're all safe. What's known is that the individual that calls attracts the attention of the predator to itself, and that individual has a higher chance of being predated upon by the hawk or coyote or whatever than it would have otherwise. It could have just dove down the hole. It didn't have to give this alarm call and attract attention to itself. That's a significant evolutionary cost, right? It's about twice as likely to be the focus of the predator as if it doesn't call. More than twice, between 2 and 3 times. So then you can look at who calls. There's a series of these graphs that look kind of like this. These really ugly yellowish bars are the data of what actually happens, and then the blue line is the null expectation. So we've talked a bunch about null expectations and null models. The null expectation is based on how many of those types of individuals are in the population at that time. So if they were just randomly doing it, then they'd be in proportion to that age and sex class of individual. So what you see is that adult females give alarm calls a whole bunch. They give them at around 70%, despite only being 40% of the population. So they're calling much more than you would expect by chance. Adult males, total slackers, right? 1 year of females, more than you'd expect by chance. 1 year males, a little bit less. And then juveniles call at approximately the rate you would expect just from their frequency in the population. So it's these adult and 1-year-old females that are calling, that are being more altruistic than you'd expect, and the males not. Now what's cool about this is whether they call or not also depends on who's nearby that could get the benefit of this warning. So if your daughter or granddaughter are nearby, see if I can fix this. Oh, Nope, not like that. If your daughter or granddaughter are present, then you call more than you'd expect by chance. But if who's there to be warned by you is not a genetic relative, then you call less than you would expect by chance. So it's not just that females call more because they're in these groups of sisters and aunts and grandmothers. Females call, it is in part that, but it's also selective based on who's the likely beneficiary. Is the likely beneficiary a close genetic relative or not? That's when they're more likely to call. So, big effect for if daughters or mothers are there, but cousins and nieces and these kind of things, there's no significant difference of their likelihood of calling. So females call more to warn close genetic relatives, and the other kinds of interactions are not different from chance. Oh, except for the adult males call less than you would expect by chance. Probably. All right, so skip that one. All right, then you can look at a whole measures of cooperation in nest defense against some predators and all kinds of sorts of activities. And what you see is that cooperation is high or relatively high among genetically related individuals. Mother and daughter, R equals 0.5. Littermate sisters. If they're sisters in the same litter, there's a reasonable chance that they're full siblings. They might not be full siblings, but there's a reasonable chance that they're full siblings. The next category, non-littermate sisters. These are sisters from different litters. They could be full siblings, but it's much more likely that they're half siblings. But anyway, so over here you have R ranging from about 0.5 to maybe 0.25, somewhere in there. And all of these kinds of interactions, these individuals that could cooperate with each other have relatively low degrees of relatedness compared to these, and they're much less cooperative. So you see warning and risk based on the genetic interactions and who's present, as well as just overall cooperation affected by genetic relatedness of the individuals. It's pretty cool. All right, let's see. So these birds are called bee eaters, and this is an example of what are called helpers at the nest. This kind of thing was described first in birds, which is why it's called helpers at the nest, because birds have nests. But the same kinds of interactions happen in other sorts of socially cooperative organisms. And basically the deal here is that the young of the previous season sometimes stay with their parents and help rear siblings. Unlike the ground squirrels, it's usually the males from previous years that stick around and help out their parents, and the females that disperse in birds. But there's variation depending on what kind of bird you're talking about. And the reason, the number one reason this appears to happen is what's called an ecological constraint on reproduction elsewhere. Ecological constraint is a sort of fancy kind of term for there aren't any other territories, or something about the ecology of the organisms are limiting their other options. And this is going to be important when we talk about this idea of cost, right? BR minus C is greater than 0. That C cost depends on what your other options are. So you might be better off leaving your parents and starting your own territory and starting your own nest. But if there aren't any nest sites available because of these ecological constraints, then what are you giving up by staying home? You're giving up the opportunity to reproduce on your own, but what was the likelihood of successfully reproducing on your own if there aren't any available territories? All right, so here's my true confession. I gave up on being a famous rock star at like 19 or so. What did I actually lose? What did I actually give up? What was the likelihood that I would become a famous rock star? I'm tone deaf, I can't sing, blah, 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 right? So the cost that I paid is they're what are called opportunity costs. They're the costs of not doing something. You go to university and you're paying costs of tuition, blah, 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 but you're also you're taking that time and giving up the opportunity to do something else, like go work at McDonald's, right? That's an opportunity cost of going to university. These BR minus C things, a lot of the times, this cost is an opportunity cost, which depends very, very much on what your other options are. So when there's these strong ecological constraints, if what you're giving up is the opportunity to breed on your own in your own territory, but it wasn't going to happen anyway because there are no other available territories, then that cost is low, is what I want you to understand from that. Okay, so that's easy to demonstrate. You go shoot the birds in the neighboring territories, and guess what happens? These helpers at the nest go away. They stop helping, and they go set up a territory on their own. It's an easy experiment to do with sufficient aim. All right, so what's cool about these bee eaters is that they don't just live in single-family units. They live in these larger kind of clan things. So they have the opportunity to not just stay in their kind of parent clan territory. There's several steps involved. They stay home instead of dispersing. And then if they stay home, they have the opportunity to help bring food, defend that territory, and so on. And then they also have the opportunity to give that help differentially to different individuals within the clan, to highly closely related kin or less closely related kin. So you can look at the probability of helping ones that are natal, means by birth, and in-law, this is like your aunt and your uncle. You're genetically related to one of them and not genetically related to the other. The natal ones are the ones that are genetically related by birth, and in-law ones are not genetically related to you. And you can see there's a huge difference in the probability of helping based on whether they're genetic relatives or sort of socially married-in relatives, as it were. You can look, this is a more detailed look at where help goes expected and observed for different degrees of relatedness. If R is 0.5, then helping is 2 to 3 times what you would expect by chance alone. If R equals 0.25, the helping still exceeds what you'd expect by chance alone, and then it's near random for 1/8 and a 12th, and then when R equals 0, there's lots of individuals in the clan that have an R near 0, so the expected level of helping would be high based on random, and the observed is really low for that group. So there's strongly differential helping where help is directed towards these close genetic relatives again.
Is the expected line just calculated by population size, like how many relatives you have of that?
Yeah, if you're in a clan of 10 individuals and 6 of them are genetically not related to you, then the null expectation of giving help to those individuals would be 6 out of 10 for a non-genetically related one. So it's just, if you were distributing help randomly, it would go proportional to those kinds of individuals in the group, in the population. Yeah. Okay. Does helping matter? Are there actually inclusive fitness benefits? And the answer is yes. So lots and lots of these kinds of birds have been studied, and the inclusive fitness benefits do vary. In the case of these bee eaters, on average, each helper added about a half an offspring fledged. So it's hard to get all the food and raise these things. Having more helpers means you can bring more food, you can have more eggs that successfully grow up and become young birds and fly away. That's what the fledging is when they become flight independent. If they're full siblings, then the inclusive fitness is half of 0.47, so that's not trivial. Because reproduction elsewhere is unlikely, this opportunity cost idea that I was talking about, the benefit is 0.47 offspring, R of 0.5, and the C is an unknown number, but we imagine it to be low. that's kin selection favoring these various kinds of altruistic things. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, that is the primary explanation for most instances of apparent altruism. That's the kind of thing that you see over and over again, is where you see apparently altruistic stuff, you have kin groups involved and kin selection as a probable explanation. But you can also have altruism and cooperation evolve between genetically unrelated individuals. So if R equals 0, then Hamilton's rule obviously won't favor the spread of those genes. So altruism among unrelated individuals requires what's called reciprocity, which is a time delay. I do something nice for you now, you do something nice for me in the future. There's some kind of payback is the idea of reciprocity. So the trouble here is it's not necessarily evolutionarily stable. I could do something nice for you now at a cost to my evolutionary fitness and a gain for your evolutionary fitness, and then you could just screw me over, right? There's no reason that you have to pay me back in an evolutionary sense. So how to avoid that depends on several things being involved. One is that there's an asymmetry of cost and benefit. So the cost to the actor is less than the potential benefit to the recipient. And this is where it gets important to think in fitness terms of these costs and benefits, not just non-fitness terms. So if I'm starving to death, how much is a bagel worth to me? A lot. If you've just eaten Thanksgiving dinner, how much is a bagel worth to you? Not much. You cannot think of the levels of assistance and help as like calories or something like that, because they're not equivalent to different individuals at different times. The 500-calorie bagel has different fitness benefits and costs to different individuals at different times. So a starving individual is very unlikely to give a well-fed individual a bagel, because that cost-benefit asymmetry goes in the wrong way. But a well-fed individual could easily afford to give a starving individual a bagel, and then you would have, for the same gift, you would have a big asymmetry in costs and benefits that favors the benefit to the recipient is much greater than the cost to the actor. Okay? So that's one thing. Then the other thing is, if I'm going to do something nice for you and you're going to screw me over, I don't want to fall into that trap over and over and over again. Then I'll just be a sucker time after time after time after time. Really, the only way to prevent that is to have social interactions that are repeated over time. Large numbers of social interactions between individuals allow me to effectively punish you for not having paid me back from the last time I helped you. We'll explore that a little bit more. But that allows the kind of the policing of cooperation that can allow it to evolve between genetically unrelated individuals. So the evolution of cooperation in this kind of genetically unrelated scenario, non-Hamilton rule scenario, reciprocal altruism scenario, is modeled by this, it's called a game from economics. What's called game theory has this thing called the prisoner's dilemma. And the idea here is that these two guys get caught for doing a crime. So they're both prisoners. They're being questioned separately. And one of them, they both have the temptation to say, I didn't do it, but the other guy did, and I'll testify against him. That would be not cooperating. That would be the selfish thing to do, right? Probably be the smart thing to do, but whatever. The cooperating thing to do is for both of them to say, I didn't do it, he didn't either, I don't know what you're talking about, right? And then you have these different kinds of defection. It could be that they both turn on each other. they both say, I'll testify against the other guy, right? That would make them get this kind of reward where they're punishment for mutual defection. So the highest reward is if they both cooperate. They might both get light sentences. But they have these temptations of being selfish and having the other guy take the fall, basically. So that's why it's called the prisoner's dilemma. And we have to stick a slide in here. There have been a whole lot of evolutionary models run with this, but the way it works is if these prisoners are together only once, they both should turn on the other one. They should hose the other guy over, right? But for cooperation to evolve, they have to have these repeated interactions. And what the behavioral rule of thumb, that I've kind of called it, that leads to the highest fitness and stable cooperation is called tit for tat, which comes from the British kind of slang. This for that, like British Cockney, tit for tat, mate, something like that. And what it is that the behavioral rule is that in the first instance of a social interaction, you should be nice, or cooperate, or be altruistic. That's step one. And then every time after that, 2 through infinity, what you should do is do what the other guy did last time. Do what they did last. That behavioral rule. First time, cooperate, be nice. Second time, do whatever they did, leads to the highest fitness, and it can lead to stable cooperation. Because if you're nice at step 1 and then they screw you over, what do you do at step 2? You screw them over. You're not a sucker over and over and over again. But if you're nice at step 1 and then they're nice, then what do you do at step 2? You're nice. And if they're doing this tit-for-tat behavioral strategy as well, then what are they going to do? Be nice. You get this reinforcing, stable evolutionary cooperation evolved between non-genetically related individuals. All right? Okay. So an example of this is in vampire bats, which there really are things called vampires, if you didn't know. They don't live in Transylvania. They're neotropical bats. They go out foraging for blood, mostly from chickens and cows and monkeys, occasionally from people, but whatever. They roost at night in these social groups, and you have often the same or a very similar social group composition in the roosts night after night after night, and they hang out. So you get a group of individuals that have lots of repeated social interactions night after night after night. And so when they go out to search for blood, a lot of them are unsuccessful. So on any given night, about 33% of the young fail to get a blood meal, and maybe 7% of the adults fail to get a blood meal on any night. And what happens is, after 3 nights without food, you're at very, very high risk of starvation. So they'll share blood with each other. A successful forager will regurgitate blood and feed it to an unsuccessful forager. Now you got to think back to the bagels. The successful forager is a long way from starvation. It was a successful forager. The unsuccessful forager is fairly close to starvation. So there's a huge asymmetry in what that blood is worth to each of those 2 individuals. And they have lots of opportunity for repeated interactions. So, wow, what's happening with that? There we go. If you look at where who they give blood to, whether they're, what's their level of association? This is the social group effect, whether they have lots of possible repeated interactions, and then also whether they're genetically related or not. There's an effect of both things. They're definitely more likely to share blood with genetically related individuals than non-genetically related individuals. But They're also more likely to share blood with social roost mates that have these long-term sort of social bonds and repeated interactions than they are with random individuals, right? So here's the distribution of all possible, and here's what actually occurs. High levels of association are the ones that share the blood. Here's the distribution of relatedness of all possible individuals, and the ones that are actually recipients of blood are skewed towards genetic relatives. So it looks as though kin selection and reciprocal altruism are playing some kind of role in those. Questions on that? All right. So that's the basics of kin selection theory, inclusive fitness, Hamilton's rule, and you can extend it beyond those kinds of social interactions like ground squirrels and alarm calling and helpers at the nest and stuff like that. And three things that occur in biology that sort of need explanation can be explained by extensions of kin selection theory. Parent-offspring conflict over allocation of resources, sibling conflict, sibling rivalries, and eusociality are all, oh, come on. There we go. Are all can be explained by thinking about this in terms of these levels of genetic relatedness. So one of the problems in these social interactions is that your genetic relatedness to yourself is 1, whereas your genetic relatedness to other individuals is usually less than 1, unless you're a genetically identical twin or a clonal species or something like that. So a relatedness to a sibling, whether they're a currently existing sibling or a future possible sibling, is, if they're a full sibling, is half of what your relatedness to yourself is. So we ought to expect that individuals would value themselves more than they value their siblings, including future siblings, right? Future possible siblings. The problem comes about is that the parents value these siblings equally. The parents are related by 0.5 to all of their kids, if we're assuming that they're all full siblings, right? So, why is it doing this? So, extending kin selection theory to parent-offspring conflict actually gives you a predictable way of, well, first of all, you would predict that this kind of conflict would exist, and you can predict the boundaries of when and how it occurs. So these graphs show the benefit to cost ratio of parental investment in a kid, in a current kid. So if the benefit to cost ratio is greater than 1, that means the benefit exceeds the cost of continued investment of the parent into that kid. So you're born, you start getting mother's milk and the car and going to university, blah, 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 blah. So this axis is investment going this way. They label it as time, which is fine if you have a constant rate of investment for time like you do with mammal mothers that are nursing their kids, which is why this is called weaning conflict. But really it's a level of investment on this axis. So you're related to yourself by 1, and if the benefit to your parents exceeds the cost, in other words, this ratio is 1 or higher, then you both agree that they should give you more resources. You want more resources, and the benefit to cost ratio to your parents exceeds 1. So from here, from this time to this time, you guys are in agreement. More resources should go to you. But at this point, right there, where that ratio falls below 1, this is an investment from the parent's point of view. Now, the benefit to cost ratio falls lower than 1 to the parents, so they don't want to give you more resources. They would rather save those resources to get pregnant again and have another kid, for example, right? To invest in a future offspring. But you are more related to you than you are to that future offspring. You would say the same thing if that was a half. So at this point, this is where the half intersects this slope. At that point on, you would agree with your parents to say future investment should go to future full siblings instead of to me. Right? So from here to infinity, you and your parents also agree. Take resource and make me brothers and sisters. Right? I'll have higher fitness if you make me siblings than if you keep investing in me. But in between this half and this 1 is where you have conflict over weaning, over the termination of parental investment in you and the saving of that parental investment for future siblings. And the root of that conflict is where you draw these cost-benefit ratio lines. So the cost-benefit ratio line of 1 is what is your parents' point of view. If your future sibling is going to be a full sibling, then it being half is your point of view. If your future sibling is going to be a half sibling, then your point of view would be a quarter, because that's your relatedness to a future half sibling. So then you'd expect a more prolonged period of weaning conflict, right? So obviously, your organisms aren't sitting around going, oh, my future sibling's going to be a half sibling or a full sibling or whatever. They're not doing any of these things cognitively like we're talking about. They haven't read kin selection theory. They don't know. But you could have a long evolutionary history of organisms that are socially monogamous where future siblings are full siblings. And so organisms that behave in a way that extends the weaning conflict to right there, they're being optimal. And after that point, they want parental investment to go to future siblings. If you come from a lineage of organisms where females mate with different males over time, then the likelihood of future siblings being full siblings is really, really low. And where selection moves BR minus C, the behaviors that are responding to BR minus C is greater than 0 kind of thing, would be different, right? If you do it right, then BR minus C is greater than 0 and it's favored, and if you do it wrong, then BR minus C is less than 0 and it's disfavored. It's not any kind of cognitive figuring it out. Okay. I think. Nope. Man, it's just worse and worse. Okay, well, I don't know what to do about that. I will keep going. So, siblicide, we had infanticide yesterday. What was that? Killing of infants, right? What's siblicide? Killing your siblings. So that's kind of this extreme form of sibling rivalry. And it occurs in some groups of birds. It occurs in essentially every clutch, every year. The older, stronger nestling kills the younger one and gets all of the parental investment to itself. What's kind of bizarre about that to people who are observing this initially is that the parents don't intervene. The older, bigger, stronger chick is just pecking the other one on the head, kicking it out of the nest, beating it up, tossing it around, and the parent birds sit there going, you know. They don't try to intervene at all. What appears to be happening is that second chick is basically laid as an insurance policy. If there's something wrong with the older first one, then it'll die or the egg's not fertile or whatever, and then the parents have a second offspring that they can rear. If there happens to be a superabundance of food that year, then maybe the parents can rear both. But the normal course of events is that there's, an average number of food that year, and the second chick dies as a result of harassment from the older one. And parent birds actually are thought to facilitate this by starting to incubate eggs at the time that they're laid. So birds usually lay an egg a day. So a 5-egg clutch is usually laid over 5 days. And to have synchronously hatching offspring, the parents can not incubate the eggs until day 5 and then start incubating them, and then all the offspring will hatch at about the same time. They'll be all about the same size and strength. But if you lay an egg on day 1 and start incubating it, and then lay the next egg the next day, and then start incubating them both, you've given a systematic advantage to that first chick. And that's what most bird species appear to be doing. And it's siblicides the result. Stop it! All right. Well, eusociality is it's kind of like helpers at the nest, but taken to a really, really extreme degree. And in eusociality, you have things that you have in helpers at the nest, such as overlapping generations. Parents and offspring co-occur. You have cooperative brood care, like you do with helpers at the nest. You have different individuals helping raise these offspring together. But what's different is that you have these specialized non-reproductive castes. You have tasks assigned to certain individuals that are non-reproductive. In some eusocial organisms, they could switch and reverse. They could be non-reproductive for a while, and then they could become reproductive if that opportunity arose. But there are others, like bees. All the worker bees are non-reproductive females. They cannot become reproductive. So now here is a big evolutionary problem, right? How do you evolve organisms that cannot reproduce and don't reproduce? That seems like it really flies in the face of what we're talking about of fitness and natural selection and maximizing reproduction. How do you evolve non-reproductive stuff? So, I don't know why. Well, it's found in a big black box at the bottom left of the screen. It's found in naked mole rats, which they're not moles, they're not rats. They're a family, Bathorigidae, of African subterranean rodents. You get the picture of them still. They are naked. They live in these underground tunnels, which is why they don't have fur. They live in sort of colonies with a king and a queen and all these worker mole rats that go around defending the colony and collecting tubers and roots and stuff to feed the offspring. And the king and queen mole rat basically beat up the helper workers so that they're physiologically stressed and non-reproductive. So they increase their corticosteroid levels to the point where they're physiologically non-reproductive individuals just by being harassed and beaten up by the king and the queen. You also have, what else is under the black box? You have lots of eusocial insects, mostly in the order Hymenoptera, but also there's a beetle that is eusocial. There are some aphids that are eusocial. There's some snapping shrimp that are eusocial. So there's, multiple times has this kind of thing evolved, despite it seeming really counterintuitive that you can evolve non-reproductive stuff. I can't see what's under the big black box. Did I miss any? No? All right. Points for me. Oh, this will tax my memory. All right, eusociality in insects. So the order Hymenoptera is a huge order of insects. It includes all the bees and ants and wasps, but it also includes sawflies and parasitic wasps and things like that. And within them, there are at least 13 different times that eusociality has evolved. So all ant species are eusocial, so you assume that it evolved in the common ancestor of the Formicidae, the ants, right? So that's one evolutionary event. But within the bees, there are at least several different times has this evolved. Thrips, aphids, a beetle, other instances. I forget how many total instances there are. But there's lots. I'll try to trick it. Oh, there they were. What did I miss? Oh, termites. How could I have forgotten termites? The Isoptera. They're all eusocial as well. And, but they're structured very differently than the Hymenoptera are, as we'll see. Okay, so how does this evolve? What's an evolutionary explanation for evolving these sterile, non-reproductive castes? And not surprisingly, you know, you've got to go back to Hamilton's rule. Two things are of really importance. What's the relatedness between the individuals, and what are the true costs of helping and being, you know, a sterile worker or a soldier or whatever versus doing something else? The true cost meaning factoring in the likelihood of your success at attempting that other thing. But the pathways to it are different in these different groups. So high relatedness should be important, but the mechanism of getting high relatedness is really, really different. So what happens in termites and naked mole rats is they live in these colonies with a king and a queen. I already told you that the mole rats basically physiologically suppress reproduction in subordinates by beating them up. Termites, the king and queen termite release pheromones that say, I'm the king and I'm the queen, and those pheromones reproductively inhibit the other workers. But what happens if the king dies? Then the king pheromone goes away. And now the workers, some of the workers, the male workers, can become new kings. Who are they going to mate with? Their mom and their sisters and other. They're not dispersing. They're mating within that termite colony. The same kind of thing happens in naked mole rats. So you have these colonies of termites and naked mole rats where there's really high levels of inbreeding. These are both diploid organisms, but they're not outbred diploid organisms. So with inbreeding, as we saw when we talked about non-random mating, that increases the likelihood of individuals sharing rare alleles by descent, because this 50% thing at meiosis doesn't happen if they're closely related to each other with this history of inbreeding. In contrast to diploid organisms, you have haplodiploidy in all hymenopterans, ants, bees, wasps, and all the other stuff as well. And also in the group, the thrips, the order Thysanoptera. And we'll explain what haplodiploidy is in a second, because it's a little bit complicated. But it's a different genetic mechanism that leads to high levels of relatedness. And then within the aphids, you have clones. So here, these are diploid, but R equals 1 in these clones, because they're genetically the same things. So this haplodiploidy business occurs because of how eggs are fertilized or not. So females with haplodiploidy, females are produced from fertilized eggs, so females are diploid. They get one set of chromosomes from their mom in the egg. That egg gets fertilized by sperm that brings the other set of chromosomes. They're diploid. Males are produced from unfertilized eggs, so they're haploid. Males, in haplodiploid species, males do not have fathers, right? They just come from these unfertilized eggs. But that totally changes how you calculate relatedness among these individuals, because females and their sisters and brothers have different levels of genetic relatedness than you would expect from diploids, and you also have asymmetries of these different relationships. So here's a female. She's related to her mom by a half, right? She got half her genome from that mom, and she got half her genome from her dad. So here's the first asymmetry. She got half her genome from her dad. She's related to her dad by a half. What's the relatedness of dad to her? 1. He gave all of his genome to her because he's haploid. Now let's put another sister over here. This sister is related to mom by a half, and she's related to her dad by a half. But guess what? So these two sisters, they're both related to mom by a half. Is it the same half? No. That follows meiosis. They're both related to their dad by a half. Is it the same half? Yes, because he's haploid. That's all he has, right? So it's as though these sisters are related to each other on average by 0.75 because they're related through their mother by half, but through their father by 1. The genes they get from their dad are identical because he's haploid. So now, this is kind of the big deal. Sisters are related to each other by 3/4. They would be related to their own kids by half. So with haplodiploidy, full sister siblings are more related to each other than they would be to their own kids. So helping your sisters or helping your mother raise future sisters is favored more, all else equal, is favored more than production of your own offspring. Females are also only related to their brothers by 1/4, because these brothers don't, let's see, what am I trying to do here? Switch to red. They're related to their brothers by a half times a half. He doesn't have a dad. He's not, I don't know if you call him a full sibling or a half sibling. He's a semi-sibling, related by 1/4. Okay. So, this messes up some of our calculating of how things ought to work, but it also explains a lot too. Females should prefer to rear reproductive sisters over their own offspring. Worker females should prefer to invest 3 times as much in sisters as in brothers. That would make them equivalent genetic kind of things. But queens are equally related to sons and daughters. Queens are giving half their genome to sons and to daughters. So not only does this go a long way towards explaining high levels of relatedness among sisters in these species, it also predicts a conflict between workers and queens over the allocation of resources to males or females. Here's data that kind of chart that prediction, this sex allocation. It's not just sex ratio, it's the total amount of stuff allocated to males versus females. So if you take remember, we're predicting that females prefer 3:1, and queen females, how do you like that? I just made that up. Nice symbol, huh? They prefer 1:1. So if you have, this is a kind of confusing graph, the sex ratio male to female, if it's 10:1 and the weight ratio female to male is at 10, then you have equal investment in males and females. If it's at 1 and 1, you have equal investment. So this is the line of equal investment in males and females. That's the line that we're predicting queens would prefer. This line is the 3:1. If you have 10 times as many males as females, you'd have 30 times the mass of females as males. This is a 3:1 investment line. The dots are different species, so where are the data? you can't see. Where do the data appear to fall? More on the 3-to-1 line, as though these worker females are controlling the investment in sex ratio of offspring more than the queens are. So there's this predicted conflict, and you find it. So, I mean, just to clarify, it's so weird. This explains several things. It explains the evolution of non-reproductive workers, but it also explains why, every single bee that you have probably seen in your life is a female. Most of you have probably never seen a male bee. All the ants that you see are female. All the workers, all the soldiers, there are males, but they're in the nest and they only come out when they have wings and fly and mate, and then they die. Essentially, everything that you think of as a ant, bee, or wasp is a female. And it's because these females are more closely related to sisters, because they're haplodiploid. They have higher genetic relatedness to sisters than males, and to their own offspring. So that idea, haplodiploidy, was taken as a really huge, important explanation for eusociality in Hymenoptera for a long time, and then people started to realize, well, it can't be the whole story. And here's why it can't be the whole story. Lots of species have sisters that are not full sisters. Queen bees mate with a bunch of males before they start a colony. So a lot of the sisters in the hive are not actually full sisters. They're half-sisters, which means that they're not related to each other by 0.75 more than they would be to their own kids. They're related to each other, but less than they would be to their own kids. So that seems to cause a problem for it. In some wasps, you get completely unrelated females start a nest together. It's really hard to start a new nest if you're a wasp, which is part of this sort of opportunity cost of going off on your own instead of helping your mom. But you have these unrelated queens. And then the biggest piece of evidence that haplodiploidy doesn't explain eusociality all by itself is that all Hymenoptera, every single species of Hymenoptera, is haplodiploid. Most of them are not eusocial. Right? So if haplodiploidy all on its own caused eusociality, then you'd expect all of them to be eusocial. And in fact, it's not. Here's a phylogeny of Hymenoptera. They're all haplodiploid, so you would infer that haplodiploidy evolved in the common ancestor of the whole group. Right? But these are a bunch of families that feed on plants. These are sawflies and things like that. They're not eusocial, they're not carnivorous, they don't take care of their young. They're more like little caterpillar-type larvae. Then you have these origin of carnivorous larvae, and they have all of these groups of parasitoid wasps, where these are like the spider killing, the tarantula wasps, those kind of things that provision their young with little caterpillars and dead spiders and stuff like that. And those larvae then become legless, immobile, and they're just sitting there waiting to be fed. That's at this node. And at these nodes, the nodes marked by a red thing, here, that's where you have nesting behavior evolve. And it's those that are the groups that have these eusocial species. So if there's a big picture of an insect on the slide, those are the eusocial species. So it's where you have this combination of ecological factors, of helpless larvae that require parental care, that are carnivorous and legless and can't provision themselves, and they live in nests, and they're haplodiploid. That's when you get eusociality, not just one thing all by itself. Oh. God. Getting worse. There we go. Okay. Inbreeding in termites and mole rats, that raises relatedness. The average R in mole rat colonies has been measured to be about 0.81. They're very closely related to each other, more than you'd expect by chance because of this relatedness. This picture down here is just for grossness, really. All of these little things down here, I'll try to make it bigger. All these little things down here, these are little worker termites. Here's like a large king type termite. This is the head of the queen. That's the thorax of the queen. And this giant bag of goo, that's the abdomen of the queen. Just pumping. She's just she's like a giant ovary is basically all she is. Isn't that gross? But cool. All right. So here's your kind of summary slide for eusociality. Again, it's in this context of Hamilton's rule. And the benefits are variable. The degrees of relatedness are high, but for different reasons. Could be inbreeding, could be haplodiploidy, could be cloning. The ecological constraints on other options are there's high constraints, which means the costs are low. Termites cannot go start their own termite colony all by themselves because they have gut protozoa that digest cellulose. And they need to get that from other termites. They lose that when they shed and molt and grow.